Here we go. Great, thank you. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about this. So I'm going to focus on the electricity and wider energy dimensions of climate in Ontario, but mostly focusing on where the electricity system is going. The system in Ontario is kind of an interesting case study in the sense it's a convergence point of a whole range of different debates around centralized versus decentralized pathways, and about the future roles of nuclear, gas, distributed resources, demand side measurements, and measures in energy efficiency. Just a bit of background in terms of how the system has evolved. Up until 1960, Ontario's electricity system was in fact 100% renewable, an entirely hydroelectric gravity fed. We did begin building coal plants in the 1960s and then went through a massive expansion of the role of nuclear power between the 60s and the 90s. We then, in the late 90s, had a significant portion of the nuclear fleet go on the blink, which then led to a large expansion of the role of of coal-fired generation, which set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to the phase out of coal-fired generation, which had constituted 25% of the system. This is generally regarded as the single most significant action taken by any North American government so far to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As part of that process, we did begin to introduce significant non-hydro renewables, principally through the Green Energy Act. We added about 8,000 megawatts of wind and solar, but we did also add about 5,500 megawatts of gas-fired generation, and I'll come back to that later on in the system. The Ford era is defined by a number of things, most notably and famously the cancellation of 758 renewable energy projects, including, and so far as we can tell, a unique event of actually having completed wind turbines ripped out of the ground at the White Pines project in Prince Edward County. The Green Energy Act was repealed, although in fact renewables procurement had already stopped under the wind government. The relatively successful energy conservation strategy was terminated. The entire climate change action plan, which had been adopted by the previous government, was terminated as well. The pathway now being taken by the Ford government largely laid out in the Powering Ontario's Growth document, and it has a very, very strong emphasis on nuclear and what sometimes called natural gas or fossil gas. What we are now pursuing is a fairly massive nuclear expansion program. There is the ongoing refurbishment of 4 units at Darlington, but also a proposal for 300 megawatt, what are classified as small modular reactors. There's an ongoing refurbishment at Bruce, and now proposal for 4,800 megawatts of new capacity there. Rough estimate could be in the $100 billion range there. The possibility, Pickering A has now closed. There were 4 reactors there, but the possibility of refurbishment at Pickering B, another 4 reactors, has been reopened, probably 15 billion there. And then last week, the premier announced that they want to build a 10,000 megawatt nuclear project at Wellesleyville, which is somewhere between Cobourg and Kingston on the north shore of Lake Ontario. If you were to take the actual cost of the Vogtle nuclear plant in Georgia, which is the last nuclear plant completed in North America in several decades, that would translate into a capital cost in the range of $200 billion. So the total commitment on nuclear at the moment is in the range, and this is at this stage trying to keep up a sort of chalkboard level estimate, $400 billion. Just keep in mind the idea of burying the 401 only is clocking in at around 100 billion. This is in sort of project cost to GDP ratio about the same as the Muskrat Falls project in Newfoundland relative to the provincial economy. And we know that has ended badly for Newfoundland in multiple ways. Along with this, there is clearly any growth on renewables has been terminated. There is both a growth in the role of the existing gas plants, which were only running on a very occasional basis and now are basically running flat out, and additional gas capacity is being added. The expectation is that if the plans that are currently in place continue, gas will constitute the same portion of the Ontario system as coal did prior to the phase out. And we are looking at essentially an eightfold increase in greenhouse gas emissions from the sector relative to the low in 2017. As I mentioned, no movement on renewables until very, very recently. It's not clear what's going to happen there. A little bit of re-engagement lately on conservation, demand management, demand side stuff. There's been some discussion I saw in the chat about distributed energy resources, which we can explain a little more in the Q&A, but very, very limited actual deployment, even though there's been quite rigorous analysis that suggests, well, we don't actually need to expand the role of gas if we can do distributed resources, which means rooftop solar, networked ideally with the fleets of parked electric vehicles or facilities level energy storage assets. We can talk about that later. So basically what's going on is an embedding of increasing costs and increasing emissions from the sector. It's sort of the sort of worst possible scenario on all fronts. Total nuclear program costs, say, I would estimate in the range of 400 billion. And keeping in mind that we are already subsidizing electricity rates out of general revenues to the tune of $7.3 billion a year. That is money that would otherwise be going on schools and hospitals, which is being used to artificially lower electricity rates. The projections, of course, continue upward. What we're seeing now does not include any new build on the nuclear side. This is just principally driven by the refurbishments of the existing fleet. There has been a great deal and probably more modeling in Ontario than anywhere else about what pathways to decarbonization that don't involve gas and don't involve nuclear expansion look like. These have all been pointedly ignored by the government, and it seems very much on this pathway where it's heading. The big winners, unsurprisingly, look like the institutionally embedded incumbents, Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power. There's a limited federal role here, but even the federal clean electricity regulations actually are designed very carefully to provide a loophole to accommodate Ontario's gas expansion plans, which does mean that the total, the sort of net zero target for the electricity sector nationally has been pushed back beyond 2050. The original plan was for 2035. Short on time, but just sort of comparing, where are we at? Well, we're on a high cost, high risk, high impact pathway in which all the other options are essentially marginalized. Conservation, demand side, distributed resources, renewables, thank you, interties and everything else. If you were doing this in a sustainability context, you would probably aim for the lowest risk, lowest cost, and lowest impact options first, conservation first, distributed resources, renewables and storage, strengthen interties, avoiding gas expansion. We are probably stuck with the Darlington and Bruce refurbishments, but probably don't need to go beyond that. And certainly any new nuclear would need to be subject to a very high level of scrutiny and absolutely an option of last resort. So I'll leave it there. We've not seen a lot so far from the various parties. There's a bit from the Greens just yesterday, but that's about where we are. So I'll leave it there, and I'm sure we'll have questions further on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm going to now